Okay, did everyone get the notice there that we're recording now? It's happening, it's working. Okay, terrific. Well, thank you all for joining today. Some familiar faces for me there from McMaster and a bunch that I can't see on the screen, but welcome. We have I think a fairly full discussion here, so we'll skip past introductions, but maybe if you do have a chance to speak later, that you make sure you share where you're from and your role, so we can get to know each other a bit better. As Jenna shared, we are recording, so that's underway. Jenna's introduced me. I think one thing to note, I'm trying to get better at this. My pronouns are he and him. So Andrew Pettit and my pronouns are he and him. Before we start, we're all over the place, I think, maybe right across the country, but I'm in Hamilton, which is also in the Dish with One Spoon territory. But at Ryerson, we try to acknowledge the land. And so I just wanted to take a moment to say wherever we are, we're most certainly on land that we've been invited into. And so for me, that means the Dish with One Spoon treaty, and it's a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. And the notion that we've all been invited into this treaty as welcome guests, but we must respect both the dish and the spoon. Quick agenda, but we're going to go through. I also want to just take a moment right now to acknowledge for all of us who are moving through the COVID roller coaster, either personally or professionally. I know that it's become, both in some ways comical ups and downs, but other ways, can be quite devastating for people, both whether you've experienced, loss of a loved one or loss of a job or otherwise. So I just want to say thank you for being here, and I will say take care to you, and I know that you're sending that back to me amongst all these ups and downs. I'm going to get through why I'm talking today. As Jenna shared, there was a Canada-wide recreation manager director call, and we started to talk about some things, and we landed here because I said I'd done some things at Ryerson, and we've done some things. So we'll talk more about that. We'll get through what to expect today during this session. If you're looking for the answers, I don't have them. So no, right now we're not going to have this is what you're going to do in recreation, and you will be a place in an organization that is immune to anti-Black racism. That's not what's going to happen today. But I am going to take you through what our strategy has been at Ryerson and our efforts and result to date. And we're also going to take a moment to highlight other efforts and resources, and then a little bit of a Q&A at the end. Good. So why me? As again, we alluded to, there's this at a Canada-wide call, we started talking, and some schools had made some progress, but many others were paused due to COVID or because they weren't feeling prepared to take it on. And so when I said that we were making some progress, many people said, can you share what you've done? And so that's how I've landed here. I shared that at Ryerson we had a plan and we were making some progress, although we were still mid-stride for sure, and a long, long way to go. My title recently shifted at Ryerson. I guess it feels like 6 years ago, but it was back in January. I'm now the Director of Recreation, Equity, and Active Wellbeing, and the recreation and active wellbeing would make sense to us all, but the equity-wise, that means I have responsibility across our department, not just for recreation, but also for varsity in terms of equity initiatives. How I landed there is that I've been at Ryerson for 4 years, but prior to that, I was at McMaster for 12 years in a full-time staff role. And during that time, I had a chance to learn under a lot of wonderful people there around equity issues. And I personally was tasked with taking on the Canadian University Sport Pilot Project to address homophobia and transphobia. And so it was an interesting first chance for me to be exposed to issues in a way I never knew before, and also to start to understand how would we systematically undertake understanding and addressing discrimination and otherwise. From there, I ended up being the staff vice chair at McMaster, for several years of the university-wide President's Advisory Committee on Building an Inclusive Community. And I think important to note during that I was exposed to many thinkers and educators who really were generous with their time with me and helping me to build my capacity and understanding. From there, I spent many years at McMaster and now at Ryerson, with my key focus being on increasing staff capacity around building equitable programs. So it's really been, it's not where I thought I would be in terms of my recreation career, but it's landed as the most important and sort of foundational concept to what we do. And in my recreation programs and under my leadership, acknowledging that while we're going to have an impact in terms of physical activity as a well-being and learning strategy, we need to make sure we're doing it. And we're uniquely positioned to do it in a way that goes beyond the traditional sport limitations around competition and exclusion and so on. So that notion of equity and inclusion has been central for me. But all that said, I have this background, but it's important to note that I am, as you're looking at me, if you can see me, a white man. You wouldn't know, but I'm also straight and cis. And that means that I have, relative privilege, and this is not my lived experience. So important to acknowledge that things I'm speaking to today, if I have any knowledge, it's of the generous teachers that have shared with me, and that I am forever sort of cautious, humble about speaking about someone else's experience. It's a risk, but I do feel it's one that I'm positioned to take because of my relative privilege. So here we are, we're going to try. That's why you're listening to me today. In terms of what to expect, unlike most presentations, again, I don't have anything near completed work or results to share. But there was interest in hearing the plan so far and what we've done so far. So my aim is to share the framework we're moving through at Ryerson, how we got there, the experience and results so far, and then again to highlight other efforts and work underway in our Canadian athletics and rec context, and then to open the floor to all of you to share your work, learnings, and questions. Okay, and if I can move my text around here. Good. So Ryerson strategy and approach. Important to note that we went from being the one Canadian university with a Black identified athletics and recreation director to being an all-white leadership team, because when you only have one person as your athletics and recreation director when they leave, and that's Dr. Ivan Joseph, suddenly your composition shifts. And right now we're an all-white strategic leadership team. And I want to name that to both say that our understanding of issues is inherently limited by that, but we're also being deliberate at not leaning on it as a crutch to not move, to not take the risk of doing the work that we are empowered to do by virtue of our roles. But we do need to listen as we go. We've had the support of a number of different staff in our department, as well as across campus. But one Black staff person in particular, Natalie, who's asked to remain very much behind the scenes. But Natalie's been incredibly important, particularly in moving our early thinking forward. So I just want to acknowledge that our strategy and approach has included sort of internal voices, and specifically of Black staff members. Important to note as well from a strategy perspective that equity is in my title. I have responsibility for it across the department. But I am being very careful, and we are being very careful to make sure that it's understood as a shared responsibility across our strategic leadership team, as well as all staff. So my role is to provide a framework and support the education initiatives and the accountability measures, but it's not my work alone. I'm not the equity person, and therefore I do this and everyone else steps back. So here's what we've done and are doing. I'm going to go into detail on these things. I'm going to walk you through specifically our strategy and approach, the staff workshops that we've done, our BIPOC staff group, which is a new group that we've formed, our ongoing education efforts, and then our very preliminary stages into our department-wide and unit-specific action plans that will roll out next week. Important to note here that my historical approach to taking up an equity issue like anti-Black racism would be to first assess the situation, then to educate based on that assessment. Out of that assessment and education, you could then act, and then you could repeat based on the progress you've made. We started out thinking assessment was going to be the place to start here, but then did a quick about face when we decided we would instead of putting our community through yet another survey of your experience, we would take the approach that we know these issues exist outside our walls, that racism, sexism, whatever it may be, but in this case, anti-Black racism, if it exists beyond our department in the greater world, then it must also exist inside our walls and in our community and in our workplace. So we skipped assessment, and we said, there's enough information out there to guide us. Let's move to education and action. It's also important to note in this process that for some ways better, in some ways worse, we've been very strategically, but limited in our communication, cautious about our talk versus walk concept. And I know that's been perceived as a miss for some in our community, that we should be more vocal about what we're doing in these kinds of things. But on the other hand, we wanted to get to a place where we had more demonstrable action to report on, so as to not be sort of the insult to injury of a Black staff person or a student athlete or a student who says they're talking it, but my lived experience has been very different. So for better or for worse, that's a strategy we've taken. These slides are from our internal staff meeting. So some of it's going to have very much specifics that aren't relevant to you all, but I wanted you to understand where we've been and how it got there. So from a strategy perspective, as I said, we went straight to education, and our initial focus was on full-time staff and building a shared understanding of the language that we would need, so that we could begin having conversations about these issues. It was very clear early on that there was a lack of comfort born out of a lack of understanding of the respectful words to use or how to approach concepts. So in September, we started our workshop series. I'm going to talk about our facilitator. We worked through workshops in late September, early October. Bear with me, I see a chat flashing. Is everybody else still on my initial slide, or are people moving with me?
On the initial slide.
Initial.
Yep, same slide.
Has anybody else made it to, I'm on slide 7, no?
First slide.
Okay, apologies everybody. There's been lots of words that have moved around. Thank you for putting that in the chat. I don't know why. Let me see if I can get us back to a place. Yep. Oh, now it's moved. Okay, everybody, thank you for flagging that. You've been very patient. Can you see this slide now? Okay. Tell me this. Are you still seeing that slide, or are you seeing my presenter view now?
We see just the slide, not the presenter view.
Okay. Am I moving slides for you now?
No.
No.
Watch me suffer through this tech challenge. Bear with me 1 second, everybody. Okay. I'm going to refresh here. Okay. Are we on the title slide again?
Yep, there you go. Now you got it.
Okay.
It's you moving.
Things are moving. Okay, these are the slides you missed. And we're on to this space here talking about, I guess we're one back. Okay, so I was here and we were talking about, please, if you can unmute too, because I'm not able to keep the chat and all those things going on my own here. So if I end up in that same mode again, just unmute and yell at me and we'll sort it out. So as I was saying here, we were in step 1, this workshop with facilitators. We did it via Zoom because this is the COVID moment we're in. But we knew from there that we'd move into specific staff units working to identify issues and opportunities specific to their work areas. And then on an ongoing basis, we'd be working towards integration of anti-racism, anti-oppressive practices and thinking in our work, and that we do regular progress assessments built into staff performance plans and so on. And this is important to note right here that the idea was to acknowledge the difference between initiatives and integration. So initiatives might be an event you do or a campaign, but I define it as a short-lived moment where there's a time limit on it, whether it's that one-day event or several weeks where you're running a campaign. Initiatives are important to draw awareness and to bring attention to the issues, but we're really looking in our strategy to end up in an integrated approach where the work is built into regular processes and it's central in everyone's thinking. Okay, staff workshops wise, I've had to give up my presenter notes, so bear with me here as we go. I wanted to name from a workshop perspective that we had a wonderful facilitator, Yami Kani Nsosa. Yami was a former colleague of ours at Ryerson, now working independently. She was in the consent comes first area, so has an extensive background in sexual violence, but also anti-oppressive practice in general. And so wonderful facilitator for us. I'll share links to Yami's website in an upcoming slide. But I wanted to name that we acknowledge that from an education perspective, we wanted to have a voice that could both speak to the issues and to our sport context to a degree. And Yami fit that for us and did a wonderful job. Our structure, and I'm being very deliberate of sharing this with all of you so you know exactly what we've done. Yeah, from a schedule perspective, we had a pre-workshop survey to assess where people at, where's your education level, how comfortable are you, these kinds of things. Then we moved into our first session, which was an introduction to anti-Black racism. There were 2.5-hour sessions. We split our staff into 2 groups just to make it not too unwieldy for a facilitator over Zoom. And people moved through those. That was varsity and recreation staff right across the department. We had a week in between our 2 sessions. And we used that to do guided reflection in small groups. And so we had staff assigned to groups of 3 or 4 people. And we had some very open-ended questions that I'll share in a moment to guide that self-reflection. This has been proved to be a really critical moment. Initially, we were going to have our sessions in the same week, and we ended up in this structure, and we're really grateful that we did because of what came out of that guided reflection and the sense of shared understanding and moving beyond the moment of discomfort to action. Then we had our session 2 the week after. It was solidarity in action, and the focus there was on action and what might we do and scenario-based work and so on. We also, for this session, introduced a BIPOC only breakout room. So throughout these sessions, there were breakout rooms on Zoom, and we introduced the idea of that here, and we had several staff take us up on that, and good things have come from that. I'll speak more to that later. Then we finished up with a post-workshop survey via email to understand again how people's knowledge and understanding and sense of preparedness to take on this work shifted. I'm not going to steal Yami's work nor thunder here, but I want to acknowledge the few key points that she took us through that I think are transferable to any organization taking on this type of work. Yami shared with us this notion that in our comfort zones, we're not learning anything, we're just doing. That in our panic zone, we're overwhelmed, and to think and move thoughtfully through something would be very difficult. But that the target zone for us coming out of these sessions was to be stretched, to be in a space of somewhat discomfort, but not so overwhelmed that you could continue to engage. This is a theme that then came up again and again in our sessions to remind us about when we went through our workshops, people, myself included, ended up feeling quite uncomfortable. And it was only when we got back into that guided group reflection, as well as our own personal reflection, and we remembered that that was the desired outcome. That was by design that we ended up in that discomfort, and it wasn't to be, frowned upon as a failed outcome. Instead, it was exactly the target. Yemi moved us through in the workshops through several concepts. Some of you may have seen these types of graphics around in different presentations or social media posts that you've seen. The one on the left is about the difference between overt acts of racism or white supremacy and the covert, subtle ways that these things play out in our workplaces and communities. Yemi put that to us and asked us to go into our breakout rooms and talk about how these things are playing out in our lives, personal or professional. And it was a really powerful moment. It was important that our staff were prefaced with the idea that we wanted you to be vulnerable, but still, stretched and vulnerable, but still, it's your personal comfort level to guide you. But as when staff were vulnerable in these moments and spoke to the racism that they have taken part in, or that they bear witness to, or that's in their family or otherwise, that we started to have some really meaningful conversation and some good learning. One of the key pieces that came of that as well is that many of us felt we really don't know how to identify this in our work. And so that was just an important acknowledgement that yes, we don't know how. We don't see it in our work, we see our work. And notions of, as white people, notions of racism and discrimination are not things that we have been trained to understand. The slide on the right, or the graphic on the right there around allyship, was again a space for us to reflect on the different ways that we might take up action as a community, and the different ways that allyship might play out, and some more productive and healthy than others. Another really key point that Yemi shared with us, there was a great energy in our staff community around, let's get going, let's do it, let's get to action, next steps, next steps, next steps. And the reality, or at least where we're thinking we're going, is that this is, again, to end up in that integrated mode, not initiative based, but an integrated mode, that this is a long-term effort. And Yemi brought this information to us, and it was this notion of how organizational change works. And so she used the example of the layers of an onion and how each one needs to be peeled back and to realize substantial change. And also this convergence divergence flow, the idea that there would be times when it felt like we were coming together and making great progress, coming to a shared sense of understanding and purpose. And there'll be times when we are moving away from that. And that would be part of a natural flow of organizational change. And again, similar to us not rejecting the discomfort we felt as individuals coming out of our workshops, it would be important for us to embrace this convergence divergence flow as an organization, as opposed to expecting it to all be fixed now, and having all the answers and able to move collectively, all seeing the same things. There would be this ebbs and flows of sense of progress. On this note, Yami also suggested, one thing she left us with was create a timeline so that people can see where you started and where you are and where you're going. Because as human beings, having the sense that you're part of a bigger process is reassuring that there is a plan and that there has been progress to date. So that was a point of emphasis that came out of Yami's workshops, and in response to our staff's desire to get going. Okay, I wanted to, any questions on the workshop piece? And then I'm going to take you through the guided group reflection, but any questions before I do on what we did with Yami as our facilitator? I can only see a few of you, so if you're waving at me, just unmute, please. Okay, thumbs up from people.
Oh, good, thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody. So the guided group reflection, this was an interesting space, and this is again my role as that sort of lead responsibility, was to set this framework for us. That yes, you were going to be as staff pulled into and assigned to a group and expected to move through this. And our staff really embraced it and did well. I've purposely put this slide up so you can see the questions. This was the shared Google Doc. What happened was that people were assigned to the groups and then told to go to the Google Doc, and they had a note taker to share their group's thoughts and record it in this shared document so that we could collectively know where each of us and as groups had moved to in our thinking and what we were struggling with. Excuse me. I'm overcoming not a COVID cold, but a cold just the same. I want to name for us here, we had people reflect specifically on that comfort stretch concept. We wanted them to know and be reminded of the discomfort being an important outcome. And we wanted them to feel comfort in their discomfort, because people are left just uncomfortable, it's not a very productive space. Otherwise, question 2 and 3, very open-ended. What's crystallized for you in your thinking since session 1? And what are you still thinking about, wondering about, questioning? We use that guided group reflection then to seed some of what we did during session 2. And again, we did that summary of group discussions and responses in the shared Google Doc, which now has become an ongoing collection of our thinking and a milestone in our timeline, if you will. Okay, I wanted to share with you, these are slides from our staff meeting on this, where we brought back the shared responses from those guided group reflections. My team member, Adriana Gartner, put these together for me, and she highlighted in blue relative to each question, the key theme that was coming out for each group. And so in terms of people's discomfort, people were talking about the need to learn, being willing to stretch, but are afraid to act or speak up. It was a consistent theme. And so we recognize that each of us is at a different point in our comfort level, taking the chance to speak up and the risk of making the mistake on this front. And it's become, knowing that that is a consistent feeling across our staff group, it's been something that I take up each time we talk about these issues, about the importance of pushing past that, particularly if you're in a privileged identity. Question 2 was about what's crystallized, and nothing earth-shattering here, but again, the people thought about it and they talked about it together, and that was the important part. Central themes around needing to learn more and feeling like there's still so much to understand. Question 3, what are you still thinking about? This is where we really sense the energy around our staff wanting to know what's next, how do we proceed, how do we be part of the solution, and so on. And Yami was really great at, again, slowing us down, providing that, that onion, that convergence, divergence idea, as well as reminding us that, racism is she referred to it as a technology that has been around for hundreds of years, and that we're not going, it'd be naive to think that we're going to undo it in a short moment. Also pointing out that for the majority white people in our staff, that there's an aspect of our whiteness that has us thinking that we would be able to move through this quickly and solve it, and our desire to act, and how that needs to be looked at and reflected on. Our post-workshop survey, I wanted to share this with you just to help you understand our progress and where we made it to relative to those workshops. So we asked people to comment on their pre-workshop. I don't know if you can see my mouse. I think I can do a pointer thing. We asked people to do their pre-workshop rating of their preparedness and understanding to address anti-Black racism in their work. And so you can see that there's a fair amount of people that rate themselves towards the poor side of things. Still a good chunk of people who rated themselves in the middle ground in terms of preparedness and understanding. But when we get to post-workshop, you can see there's a fairly significant shift. No one rated themselves all the way poor anymore, and the groups have collectively moved up into this higher rating in terms of their sense of preparedness. So when we look at that, it was confirmation that there was value, and we had achieved our initial kind of target of building that baseline understanding of shared language and education so that we could have meaningful conversation. These are some of the comments that people shared. I will share these slides afterwards. In the interest of time, I'm not going to walk through these too much, but they're there for you, and they'll be in the recording as well. What could have been better? People talked about more breakout room time as a consistent theme, wanting to be able to have that connection in small groups where there was less discomfort talking about the issues. When we were in our full 50-person Zoom call, people were very hesitant. I think just because it's a 50-person Zoom call, add in the topic of anti-Black racism, and it really ended up in a muted space. But when we got into breakout rooms, people said that's where important things started to come out, and they felt there was a sense of connection and learning. And then I noted here at the bottom that people said next steps 1,000 times is what they're hoping for. So again, that desire to move more quickly. Out of our workshops, we formed a BIPOC staff group. So this came about fairly organically. I said to Yami that I would like to create a space during our second workshop. She agreed. We decided she would be in that breakout room to help facilitate. I was not. It was a spaces for our Black and BIPOC staff to connect. To know that they've been sitting through trainings that are about their lived experience and watching many of their white colleagues catch up with what's been their lifetime of experience of anti-Black and racism in general. And the group reported back through Yami and then since about how important that was to them. Not everyone who identified as BIPOC that chose to take part, but those that did found it to be very, very important and powerful. And we've since translated that into a BIPOC staff group in an ongoing way that remains informal, but they have a connection point into me and our strategic leadership team whenever they want it. But otherwise, a space for them to reflect on together our progress, to guide our progress. Before each next steps meeting that I lead for our full staff group, I've committed to taking it to our BIPOC staff group for them to comment before it goes out to the larger group, and then also to reflect with them afterwards what they felt was working well and what was not. So that I think I've walked through most of this. Yeah, so I have walked through that. And one thing I'll name for you is that during one of our early BIPOC staff group meetings, the group identified, and they asked me to share it with our broader staff. They identified that how interesting it was that even in one of their first meetings, when they were thinking about how they wanted to be perceived and not be perceived by their fellow coworkers, how they were already employing strategies, tactics that keep them safe in a world of racism. They were already watering down their expectations or diluting their expectations and being careful about the language they use and how they're perceived. And it was an important moment, and they wanted that shared with our broader staff group as how pervasive the notions of racism are, that even as they're in a space specifically created to be a safe space for them, specifically created to guide our work around addressing anti-Black racism, that anti-Black racism was in that space, shaping how they were approaching it. And of course it was, but it was a good reflection point. Okay. Let me catch up here time-wise. Good. What's next for us? There's work underway right now to learn from what's happening around us. I want to name and walk through 3 of 4 in a meaningful way, and the fourth, I'm going to look to you to guide me a little bit. At Ryerson, there was an anti-Black racism climate review that was undertaken prior to this summer. And so we're leaning on that. The OUA and youth sports committees on anti-Black racism and Black, biracial, and Indigenous task force and so on. Many of us will be familiar, certainly my McMaster colleagues on this call are familiar with the anti-Black racism review that's happened there and the work underway there. We're looking at that as a place to learn for us. And then the NIRSA 21-day challenge and this roundtable. I wanted to highlight this because maybe your campuses have a similar bit of effort that's gone on through an equity inclusion office or otherwise named Human Rights Services, whatever it might be. But in 2010, Ryerson engaged in an anti-racism review on campus. And then in 2019, did a 10-year check-in on that and another full report. And that was released this July. So we're using that to guide us. Well, it's not specific to athletics and recreation. It speaks to our students' experience of anti-Black racism on campus and in university programs and facilities. So we're leaning on that, and I'm going to tell you how we're going to do it in a second. But if you're not familiar yet, the OUA BBI Black, Biracial, and Indigenous Task Force has put out a wonderful report that can be a great guide for our work. It's specific to the varsity side of things, that being an OUA initiative, but there's all sorts of threads that pull into any organization, certainly us in recreation. Obviously, we're not going in recreation to take up things like financial awards for student athletes and these kinds of things, but things around hiring, things around policies and so on are all the way relevant. The McMaster Anti-Black Racism Review, if you're not familiar, there was a review undertaken this past summer relative to student athletes' experience that have been shared on social media and otherwise, and so the university undertook a full review. The report came out end of October, and for us at Ryerson, we're looking at this with full understanding that if it's happening, again, outside our walls, aspects of it are happening inside our walls as well. And one of the interesting things that I've been thinking about at Ryerson as an institution that, like many of our schools, prides itself on being a progressive, equitable, inclusive place, that I think that the only difference at times is that in those more progressive spaces, the way these things manifest become more covert. It becomes more sophisticated and harder to see how they're happening. And so we're using this moment with the McMaster report to look at it as a general statement of where things are at, not leaving it to that's McMaster's problem or unique to them. Aspects of it certainly will be, but many of it will parallel into our spaces. So we're looking at that report as well. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, it's quite a powerful chance to appreciate what people are experiencing in their words. The report has been written very much in the words of the student athletes and staff who took part in that review. There's the NIRSA 21-day challenge, and I need to do full disclosure, I have not taken part in this yet. My high level understanding is that this 21-day challenge in many ways runs synonymous to what we did in terms of our workshops with YAMI, in terms of building that shared understanding around concepts of racism and anti-racism, language, and so on. So if you haven't had a chance to check that out, it was a first event ran in this fall, but now it's just an on-demand when you're ready for it experience. And you can sign up on the NIRSA website. I want to quickly name what we're doing with these because there's a bit of a unique approach to it. Initially, I thought I would read these reports and I would come back to our group with what are we doing about this? How do we take up what are the parallels from McMaster to us? What are the parallels from the OUA report to us? Instead, we're going to go back to those small groups from our guided group reflections and assign these reports to those groups so that this is a shared education and a shared understanding and a shared directive of what's important to us. And it's this interesting shift because this danger of being the equity person and therefore the work being seen as only mine will really limit our ability to do it well. And so we're taking this on to say it's going to be more work. This is sort of a COVID silver lining that we have capacity. We're not in a competitive season for our varsity staff. From a recreation perspective, certainly a lot of us are full go in our virtual world and when our buildings are open, but there's other times when we have capacity to do this. So that's the strategy shift where different groups are going to be assigned the McMaster report, the OUA report, and the Ryerson Anti-Black Racism Climate Report to pull out central themes that we want to take up in our work, specifically in athletics and recreation. So that's the approach we're using there. I wanted to quickly offer a chance. Has anyone taken part in the NIRSA 21-day challenge? And could you offer any perspective for someone here on this call who might consider it, but doesn't know anything about it yet?
Andrew, this is Sandra from
Hi,
Windsor.
Sandra.
Some of my staff participated in it as well as our athletics director. They found it very helpful and informative. Much of the information could be resourced after the fact. And for myself, that's what I found it to be most challenging. It was in the midst of ours trying to reopen. So it was hard to find the time to sit and listen and to participate in the group discussions that they would have at the end of the week. But even if you're able to participate in bits and pieces of it, they said it was quite helpful. And certainly that first step in increasing one's awareness and education and knowledge, as you said, to start those difficult conversations.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Anybody else have anything to add on the NIRSA 21-day challenge? The one thing I named for you that having not taken part in it, but understanding what it is that if you were to go back to your department leadership, or if you are your department leadership, I would encourage you to reference it here right now, that it is that group connection. Sandra talked about the group getting together at the end of the week. Our group, the guided reflection, it is that shared experience and the shared directive that I think really matters. It's where we saw the most impact. That's not just me as someone assessing it, it's the staff themselves talking about that those moments really mattered to both consolidate what they'd learned and to feel shared ownership for the issues. So if you are going to use that NIRSA 21-day challenge, if you can only do it on your own, good for you and keep going. But I'd encourage you to get back to your leadership to say, let's set up a group to do this and make this a department, a broader department initiative. Okay. We're at 1:44. We will finish at 2 and we'll have some time for questions here. I wanted to name for you some of the department and unit specific action plans. So this has not happened yet. I shared at the start that we don't have the answers. We've not moved all the way through it, but we feel like we're building this sense of shared language, shared understanding, and now we're beginning to drill down into the specific work areas. So from a strategic leadership team, this is our senior team, our director level staff. We've committed to reviewing the 5 key issues identified in the OUA BBI report. You'll see them listed there, and to identify in what ways do those need to be taken up in our work across the department. Next from that, the strategic leadership team is going to be setting the strategy and accountability framework for all units. And we're also going to include this in our new strategic planning process that's underway now. Our last plan's expired. And we're on pause with that with COVID, but we know this will be included. Important to note here again on the theme of me not doing it alone, I will seed that strategy and accountability framework for our strategic leadership team, but it will be driven by the group as a collective. One of the really clear things that I want to name that's also come out is from a hiring practices perspective, there's a clear call for us to slow down. And what I mean by that is when a staff person leaves, we're usually fairly desperate to move through what's not a quick process to replace them because the work is still ongoing. But we've committed as a strategic leadership team to ensure any hiring that we slow down and that we make sure that our recruitment strategy is reflective of our ambition in this regard, that we make sure that we're getting into diverse communities where we can recruit the candidates that we'd like to see and not just use our existing networks, which if we look across recreation in Canada, ends up being almost exclusively white. And while there's a wonderful range of people and different identities, that whiteness being so prevalent in our networks means that it repeats itself. So we're going to pause on our recruitment strategy and make sure we get it right. We're going to make sure we take up unconscious bias training and move beyond the concept of fit in our hiring. And then another one that's not specific to anti-Black racism or discrimination at all, but relevant, is a commitment to being transparent and intentional about sharing development opportunities. We recognize as a strategic leadership team that there's times where the first time a staff person learns about a new opportunity is when it's announced that someone else has just got it. And so while not everyone will always be qualified or able to compete for a role that's emerging or a shift, our aim is to always share that so that they can understand what the opportunity would be and how they might get qualified in future to get there. Again, being more transparent and intentional about all that. So that's from a strategic leadership team perspective. If you're a director or a manager, these are the 3 things that at that level we're taking on. Then when you get to our individual staff groups or work areas, we will be providing a framework. I don't have it here for you today, but I have the example of what we're going to use. We're going to use a framework that will be shared across all of our staff. It will identify the areas of focus. It will have reporting expectations, both the mechanism and timeline, so that we can hold ourselves accountable. And there's also going to be room around resourcing. So knowing that, we can't just expect everybody to jump in on this. They might need additional education. They might need additional human resources, whether in the form of, centralized full-time staff support or student staff support, whatever it might be to take this on meaningfully. on that end, we do know that, again, COVID is presenting an opportunity where staff do have different capacity than they would in a normal year. And so that's, while COVID's been extremely challenging, it is a bright spot here. Our intention is to use the OUA BBI report example. So if you've been in that report, you know this, and it's been laid out so wonderfully. They present the problem. What is the issue? What's the impact on the community, the student athletes in this case, or the student or the staff? And again, immediately transferable to our recreation space as well. Then they get to recommendations, and then they identify what success looks like, so they know when they got there. And so we know we're very likely to use a version of, if not exactly that framework, with great appreciation for the example that the BBI task force has shared with us there. We also know that for many, this is a very abstract concept. And so we're going to make efforts to provide examples for staff to understand how a different work unit might take up an issue of equity or addressing anti-Black racism in their work, and making it concrete through those examples so that people can see parallels in their own. This is that OUA BBI task force. I just want to share how they've done it. And you can see that in the full report. Medium term, long term, the only thing I think important to note here is that from a student athletes and student staff perspective, we know that we have, sorry, the slide is a carryover from a staff meeting. This bullet right here, we have an emerging plan about how we're going to engage our student athletes and student staff. And so we know we're going to put our student staff leaders through the same 2-session workshop that we did with YAMI again, and we'll be doing that in January. We also know that we're going to be sending out to our student athletes and student staff the OUA report, the McMaster report, the Ryerson Anti-Black Racism Climate Report, acknowledging that we know those issues exist elsewhere or in our community, and they must be happening within our department for our student staff, for our student athletes, and our student participants. And we're going to ask them to help us prioritize. So this is not assessment so much as saying, we know these issues are happening. Here's a report speaking to how they're happening. Turn our head to the area that you think is important for us to be thinking about. So again, my initial strategy would have been to do assessment. We're not going back there. We know the issues exist, but we still want to engage those students in particular around what do you want us to prioritize. So they still have a voice, but we're not going to ask them to tell us about every experience they've had. If they want to, there'll be opportunity to do that, but it's not the primary objective to put them through sharing that again. We're just going to believe them that exists. Okay. At this point, if I've done all right, I've left us a little bit of time, not a lot. Forgive me on that end, but we've got about 9 minutes here. I'm most grateful for you joining me today to hear about my unfinished work and our unfinished work here. I wanted to open up to questions as well as examples that others have that they've been working through, things that have worked, so that we can all learn from each other. So this is our roundtable Q&A aspect. So I'm going to stop sharing slides and bring us back to a group here. Does anyone have any questions or any examples of work or learning that's happened at their organization? I recognize also that this is also a larger Zoom call, talking about a difficult subject. So if you can push through that moment of hesitation to help us learn from you, I'd appreciate it. But if we don't have it, we can have 8 minutes back in our day.
Andrew, I can make comments from
Thanks,
Windsor. In our faculty, or I should say our department is unique in that we report to an academic dean. So we have kinesiology, the academic program, and then ARS, which is a department, obviously non-academic. However, within our faculty, we do have an equity committee of which I currently chair. And within that committee, we address all in a variety of issues. However, in the summer, in light of the social discourse and certainly the concern around anti-Black racism, it was decided at the time with our current dean that we would strike a subcommittee. So we have an anti-racism subcommittee currently focusing on anti-Black racism. And our faculty, including both the academic and non-academic side, we only have 2 Black professors in kinesiology, and we have only 2 Black coaches. So again, predominantly white faculty. So in making up the anti-Black racism subcommittee, one of our Black faculty members agreed to chair that committee. Along with him sit the other remaining Black full-time staff, which in total is 4. And then we invited students, student athletes and student and recreation students. And from that committee, which started again in early summer, a number of actions have taken place already. Dr. Milne, who chairs that committee, applied for 2 Ignite funding positions, and now we have 2 Black students who are acting as recruitment officers, student recruitment officers. So unfortunately with COVID, it's virtual, but they're helping to recruit students in local high schools, obviously Black students, to recommend them to come to kinesiology and come to our athletics department and really promote what Windsor has to offer. In addition, one of those students is also getting very involved with local Black organizations to again provide some more community outreach and to again share that learning and provide opportunities for our students. On the athletics and recreation side, I sit on both committees currently. On our side of the house in recreation, we immediately jumped on board. And first of all, using our social media campaign, we follow and use the dimensions of wellness. And we did that once the pandemic kind of struck. We developed a plan and said every day we're going to focus on particular issues. And then as a result of the uprising, we decided that most of our social awareness campaign would focus on anti-Black racism, Indigenous education and awareness. And so we developed that platform, and we just provided education more than anything. Within the department itself of athletics and recreation, immediately the faculty contacted, and I don't have the name of the facilitator, I believe he was from U of T, and we went through a training session with some of our student experience office staff as well. Again, just reviewing anti-Black racism, terminology, awareness, making again and starting those difficult conversations. So that was a very short, I think 2-hour workshop. And then from there, the athletic side, the varsity side, the athletes themselves were the ones that really started to push the envelope a little bit more. They wanted action. They wanted more urgency. They wanted more response from the department than what they were seeing. So some of our Black student athletes again approached the administration and said, we want something to be done. And so immediately the task force was implemented, and then there were projects in place. So they reinstituted what we call LSAC, which is the Lancer Student Athlete Committee. Upon that committee sits either captains and or co-captains of other varsity teams, and they redevelop themselves with a number of initiatives and priorities, but one of them being racism and anti-Black racism. So they've been very active in, again, through social media, through their own education. They just hosted a workshop for mental health for their athletes. So they've been, proactive too, but they very much were pressuring the administration saying, you're not doing anything and we can't just keep talking about it. So within recreation, we haven't received the same amount of pressure. And I think because the facility is not open, it's a little bit different. We just opened and we're not getting the same volume of users into the building. And even when we reflected on our staff demographics, we only had, again, returning staff to Black student staff. So we were very, again, underrepresented in those marginalized populations. And therefore, in trying to review what we were doing, it was difficult as well, because we weren't able to see from the eyes of those students that have been, subjected to any sort of systemic racism. So I decided within our, and I have a very small team. I have only 1.5 other full-time people that work for me, and we're short 2 other full-time staff right now. So, we took it upon ourselves to pull in some students and start our own sort of like SWOT analysis. Let's take a look at what we're doing well. What are we not doing well? What are some of the threats out there? And recognizing the barriers, and then going through that whole SWOT process. So we're still very much in that finding phase and reviewing our everything that we do. One tool that we do have available here at the University of Windsor, and it came from Queen's, is called the DEEP tool. And it's designed to look at equity within a department. And they just came out with an administrative module of that. So we're in the process of creating our content. And really it's a review to allow you to establish an action plan that you can annually update and review your progress. And they have 12 different indicators. And one of those indicators, again, is around equity. And it involves everything from hiring practices to, professional development opportunities. It has a component for an indicator for Indigenous consultation as well. So it's a very useful tool. So I was struggling trying to figure out what measurement tool I would use. And much like yourself, I was of the same thought, saying there's really no need to do a survey of our students, because as you said, there's enough information out there to recognize the fact that there's going to be issues whether we want to recognize them or not. And therefore it is opening our own eyes and putting on those goggles and really closely looking at everything that we do to see where those barriers might exist. So in saying that, I found the DEEP tool was something that I could create a plan around. And then much as you have done here is start putting in those pieces of what work needs to be done. And I truly agree that it's not something that we're going to fix in a month, even a year. It's going to take a lifetime of work from all of us to create some permanent change. Great. So my goal is to be able to create a model, if not for the athletics and rec department, but definitely for recreation, because we do operate somewhat independent of athletics, so that we moving forward are doing the right things as well. And we're becoming, certainly more inclusive. So
thanks, Sandra, thank you very, very much. I'm cognizant of time here and also want to get to some other people that have some hands up here. But Sandra, some tremendous resources shared there. If you didn't catch from her, the Ignite and then the DEEP tool. So we'll make sure that those get shared around with people. Jenny, I believe I saw your hand up. I know people need to go, so we're going to start to slide out of here, and do look for the recording to be up with some resources as well. Jenny McKay is typing for us. Apologies if I mispronounced your name. At Waterloo last week, we announced details on the Alliance. Yes, I saw this, Jenny. Thank you. So we'll make sure that gets linked for people. Jenny, do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot of details right now. We did just launch it last week, but it was a staff group and coaches and student athletes that have joined the Alliance. So we did the launch video, and they've got their guiding principles, their mission and vision all up on the website now. And then they've got lots of action items as well too. I think a lot of us are on the same page as we don't want to just talk about change. We do actually want to make a change. So I think that there's going to be lots of good things come out of that. We have our expression session this evening, which is their first actual event for the Alliance. So looking forward to that. And we've got, I think, about 40 or 50 registered for that so far. So yeah, lots of things happening, but I definitely encourage, if anybody's interested, to check out that website, and then the contact information for the Alliance is on that website as well.
Yeah, and if you're in the chat, you can see that Jenny has put the link there with a bit of information. Thank you, Jenny, for sharing. Okay, everybody, we're past 2 o'clock. I'm very happy to stay here with anyone who would like to for the next 15 or 20 minutes. I'm also more than happy to connect with you via email if it's at all helpful. I hope today's discussion has been meaningful for you. If I can leave you with anything, I'd say is the notion of pushing past our concern about not getting it all the way right and therefore doing nothing. Let's trust the information that's out there, and let's understand that even as we are maybe learning under the topic of anti-Black racism and otherwise, that we do have frameworks of how you would move through, how you would develop an action plan. And we can educate ourselves to seed and build out that plan. That's within our skill set. We move mountains and large groups of people, and we change the world in a recreation way. And the angle of addressing anti-Black racism or equity issues can be put into that same skill set that we know so well. So I encourage you to keep going, get going, and please look back if you have any questions or I can support in any way. Or if you find something great that you can teach us all about. I'm going to put my email in the chat. If you have any questions or want to stick around, please do. But otherwise, I'm going to, I guess I'm going to keep the recording going. I'll stop the recording. And if you want to ask questions in a not recorded way, you can do that. There's my email in the chat. If you want to connect, I'm going to stop the recording, everybody.